Okay, I've just walked down Calle Velázquez, and I'm down to where the center of this area is, the cathedral there on the straight ahead. It's a pretty building on the right, and the very tip of the tower looking over that building there is where we're going to go this morning. I believe this is the Church of San Francisco, but I'm not positive. It looks like a museum. It's being redone on the front. Much of this area is continually upgraded for obvious reasons. Isn't this a beautiful building and a lovely section of buildings? The architectural style doesn't look like Mudahin. It looks like pure Christian, except for the use of the graphic tiles, of course. A very beautiful building. This one's so, but not dramatic. Because brick is not solid enough for the base of this huge tower, Roman blocks have been used. Now, looking closely at these stones, Rick says we should be able to see some Latin carved into it. That may be what he's referring to there. And here on the other side of the corner, and this may be it. Standing now behind the main altar on the outside, and then this beautiful square, which I think is called Plaza de Virgen de los Reyes, or King, Virgin of the Kings, is this pretty square, which I think will be where Rick has us starting his self-guided walk of barrio Santa Cruz. And this is the old Jewish quarter, but as he points out, other than the location and the tangled streets, that's it. There's nothing else. Strange person to Michael Jackson. And this is the iconic Virgin's tile. Important to civilians because apparently it was the image that the Spanish king carried with him, probably not that big, when he threw the Moors out in 1248. Now with the cathedral direct behind me, we're looking up this street, and Steve notes that the typical government protected whitewash and goldenrod color is in evidence here, at least on that building in the far. Walking to the left of the rear, as you're facing the rear of the cathedral, you come to Plaza del Trufuno. And here's a map. Here's the cathedral. Here's where we started behind it. Here's where we walked down. And we're standing about right at the tip of my fingernail on my index finger. And we're going to walk up here in just a moment. This was put here as a thank you to the Virgin for not having been destroyed in the 1755 earthquake that destroyed Lisbon. One wonders why she was so powerful enough to stop Seville from getting damaged. Why didn't she help out Lisbon? And why didn't she just stop the earthquake in the first place? And where did she get all that power? Now this is apparently a wall of Alcazar, so we're actually going into it at this point. So we've come through that arch and we're now in the Patio de Banderas. Banderas referring to flags, but why it's all closed off, I don't know. Orange trees are prevalent here, as they should be elsewhere, because they never lose their leaves, although Rick points out the oranges are too bitter to be used for anything other than commercial uses. This was once a kind of a military parade ground. It's also where the king's bodyguards were. We're now at the opposite end of that patio, and say, I believe, refers to cathedral, so this might have been a very old cathedral. And this is apparently a classic view of the tower. Passed through from that Banderas patio, another series of arched houses, if you will, above the arches to get to where we're going. One of the reasons for these houses over the arches is that, particularly in this area where the barrio is, where it used to be Jewish, this was a ghetto. And like all ghettos for the Jews, they were forced to live, no matter what their population was, inside the ghetto. And so they took advantage of every space, horizontally and vertically, that they could find. Here, a pretty little corner arch, fountain, in just a simple crenellated corner of this wall. Here we are in the first little square that we're going to wander through, jammed with tour groups and groups of high school kids. Follow the wall, the crenellated Alcazar wall along this narrow alleyway. Here's a perfect little view of the kind of streets that you get here. Some of them called kissing streets because they're so close. Again, remember the Jewish point. Not just because it would keep them cool. That's something you say when you don't want to discuss the Jewish issue. The hand and a half width of these balconies. Long alleyway alongside Alcazar called Calle Agua. Picturesque little scene. Okay, we're looking back down Calle Agua, but what's most interesting are these two pipes right here. These used to bring the water into Alcazar. Whether there was an aqueduct as part of it, I don't know. With my back to the end of Calle Agua, we're now standing at the entrance of the Murillo Gardens. Murillo for the painter Murillo. This is a little view into the backyard of one of the houses along Agua Calle, which are, as Steve Rick says, very exclusive. Number 6, I think it was, he wanted us to look in through the gate. They've closed it so you can't disturb their tranquility. And from where we just were, we're now walking into Plaza de la Cruz. It's these plazas that make living in a spot very, very pleasurable, in my opinion. I suggest that this is arguably the heart of the barrio, at least today, and might have been in the past, even though no direct evidence of the Jewish occupation. Pretty little centerpiece for this park. This was once the site of a synagogue. There were 3 on this square. They're all gone. Synagogue destroyed by the Christians when they took over. Then they built the church, which then Napoleon destroyed when he took over. He indicates that that's flag there on the right, the tricolor, which is the French flag, reminds these folks of that destruction by Bonaparte. But the tone of Rick's book is that it's a positive. I don't see that. Interesting and nostalgic fact is that underneath the church that was here, the artist Murillo was laid to rest, buried, and he now lies somewhere underneath all of this. That's a cruel irony considering his fame in Spain. Here they're working on some of the infrastructure there. You can see some of the pipes crossing from the past. I mean, currently being used. We're going to go down this little narrow alleyway to Plaza de Refinadores. An idea of the distance. This is not the narrowest, apparently. And there's the park we're going to visit later, dedicated here to that famous Spanish painter. And here we're in the plaza, and what's interesting is the statue over here of a legendary figure, and that is the famous Don Juan, who unfortunately, or fortunately, was fictional as a character. However, there was a person of that name who wasn't fictional, but was apparently a sex fiend, as Rick describes it, and he was an atheist and flaunted all of that in the face of his culture at the time. That would be worth exploring, considering what they usually did to people that violated their rules. It's more likely he would have been burned at the stake here in this square. Isn't that a pretty little building face squeezed into that corner? And either it or the red building has that patio up on top. And there's another patio on the adjacent building. Now from that square, we're traveling up Santa Teresa. And here's some tile work of the mystical nun. I don't think that's the Sister Teresa that we're used to thinking of, who came from somewhere in the Bulgaria area, or those areas that I visit. And I'm sure this little bar would, and her name on it, would warm her heart if she were here, not to mention her innards, if she could take advantage. Another example of how this tile work adds a real sense of beauty to any place it's installed, even if everything else around it is deteriorated. Now I believe we are going to be walking down a street filled with tourists. Here we're at Casa Museo de Murillo. This apparently was Murillo's home. So he's not too far from it now, we just don't know where. A little bit of a look of how it would have looked. And directly across the street is the Monasterio de San José del Carmen, which is not open and actually is pretty plain looking. It's interesting to imagine the women who walked through that door one and last times, plagued by whatever horrific reasoning made them decide it was important to end their life and give it to Christ. Those two things are not necessarily the same. There's a lovely little breeze coming down here and incense wafting along on it. Now we start down one of these kissing streets, now that I've finally oriented. Here someone's bought this cavity and is now gutting what they can't use and getting ready to use what they can use. Another era, that's room's been preserved perhaps somewhere. I wonder how old this cement sculpture work is. All you can do in the tour group in front of you is just stop and sit and do nothing for a while. Pass things back and forth between balconies. Inside of a hotel, on the wall as a display is this woodwork. Hopefully it's Arabic and from the past, as well as these, what would have been lanterns. Probably to hang somewhere on the corner of a building or patio. Look at the pretty detail and the color. Inside of a hotel. A gentleman invited me into the hotel to take a closer look at this. Notice that it had a lock on it also. But how plush compared to the ones we saw the other day. Don't know if this door is original, but it certainly looks like it. And someone who spent the money to buy such a rare piece, I would think, as we just saw. I'm in the vestibule now, which is impressive, and Rick said, don't be alarmed. There'll be more that are more impressive. But I couldn't resist. Plus there's a tour group over there. One of the underlying powerful themes here, design-wise, is cool and tranquility. Cool reflected in the water. It's hard, even with a video camera, to take in the magnitude of this. Look at how this is a carved arch on the inside, if you will. And again, Muslim detail. Within this pool structure, at each of these corners, there are a total of 4 cisterns, which provide water to the entire palace complex. Here's this beautifully detailed arch. The symbolism is straightforward or Arabic, and they're not alone. The dome represents the sky, in other words, the sphere around Earth, if you will, and then the cube represents Earth. We're in the courtyard of the dolls. It's 3 stories, not including that glass cupola. The top 2 stories were added centuries after this was originally designed. One of the underlying powerful themes here, design-wise, is cool and tranquility. Cool reflected in the water. It's hard, even with a video camera, to take in the magnitude of this. We enter into the hall of the ambassador with this spectacularly large dome. Again, imagine the work that it took to create the detail on these walls. Apparently, King Pedro dumped his wife and brought his mistress here and made the major improvements for he and her. Rick Steves finds that to be sad. I don't know the fact. Here a pan just for its effect. Look at the shades, the colors, the planes that we get. The irony is, while I'm unable to interpret it, or even find it for that matter, there is a mixture of not only Christian sayings, but very, very Muslim sayings in Arabic. And this was known. This was just part of the motif of that culture, this culture. We're in the courtyard of the dolls. It's 3 stories, not including that glass cupola. The top 2 stories were added centuries after this was originally designed. Originally, this portion that we're looking here, the lower floor, was for Pedro's private use and the use of his family. And it once had a pool in this recessed area here, adding reflection and like mirrors on walls, adding dimension to this room. Ironically, if it were still here, it would add tremendous dimension because it would show 3 stories of reflection. Columns alternate black, white, pink. This room, including the rest of this room, was the Queen's bedroom, where she gave birth to Prince John or Juan. I'm here knowing that birth was given somewhere here to an important person, but perhaps because I lack the depth of cultural feeling and history, I cannot empathize. I can't get my mind to get a grip on why this should feel important to me, and yet it's historically important. So notice on this first floor the lobed arches, and then impressive ceiling. This is the chapel. That's the holy water thingy. The tile is always the most exciting, impressive element. Certainly here where it's just goldenrod and white. Pretty ordinary and simple. This was the banquet hall where Ferdinand and Isabella's wedding was held. Hard to imagine. You'd have to try a long, long table filled with people. Whether it was raucous, excited laughter and talk, or Subdued, I don't know. Imagine the waiters flitting about with platters and bowls and glasses. Probably an old Flemish tapestry. This one probably representing the various countries that ships of Spain visited and the birds that were there. And probably examples brought back here. Adjoining this room, the room of tapestries, first of which is this huge map. Imagine what it would take to create tapestries of this size. And look at the detail here. Certainly a king could requisition what he wanted. But you can well imagine that the effort required, the technology that the day required, might just very well equal that of doing it in tile or of painting it. The detail here is interesting. A jammed harbor. Looks like a canal there. Where this is, I don't know. Military, of course, involved. That looks like a fortress for sure. And are these the breastworks of the opposing armies? Looks like those are turbines. It's interesting, the large-scale fishermen here and bringing fish and water to the shore. A shore punctuated by the rotting corpses, it looks like, of dead soldiers. And here wheat, more soldiers and horses. Notice here in the lower left a woman, apparently. So one wonders what this is about. And what's that conical device there? Notice this map also flips the context north to south, so that Iberia is up in the north there, and the Atlantic is to the right, and to the left is the Mediterranean and Italy in the lower left-hand corner. These are the gardens. Rather simple right now. The close-up of some of the tile work in the banquet hall. And here on the opposite side, a curious humanoid figure. These somewhat curious rabbits look coy. Here we've just exited from the banquet hall, as you can well imagine. Hundreds dead, if not thousands, to this pool, and then out to these gardens. One can well imagine after the dinner walking through the gardens, I guess. And here was some rather quickly done, it looks, watercolor painted panels. But it probably gives an idea of how these little niches all along this wall were decorated, and maybe the entire wall. This is interesting. It's fun to see what it exposes. A pretty little place with its Gothic arches. Cool. All year long, I suspect. And how lovely it would be just to come down here and lie in the pool. It's only about a foot deep now, but it could be as much 6 or 7 inches more than that. Here a pretty little water feature. It would have been filled with water as a pool and some benches to sit on. There, the dancing garden, and entrance into the banquet hall. Not terribly impressive right now. Maze looking with its hedges, but during the time of the various rulers, there's no end to the imagination and creativity of its gardeners. And given everything else in the way of beauty and detail, you can imagine these were really out. Here we're in another section of the garden divided by this wall, and it has a sizable court and some other buildings over here to the side, so we'll explore that a bit. This pretty little building with its reflection pool, fountain, And all of this border could be sat upon. No wonder these fish survive in the green swill. Often the swirls you see is the result of their fins. This is a pretty little building. Again, you don't know how much of it was the original caliphs versus the kings of subsequent years. And here's the maze garden, so often alluded to in literature as a place of trysting and intrigue. Imagine the sword thrust that goes straight through the hedge and into you. Here, of course, people have made their own access routes through the maze. And here we find ourselves still within the crenellated walls of Alcazar in what is more park-like to most of us. The big trees, the expanses of lawn, the art glass. Notice the house is 40, 50 feet above the palace grade. Another lovely attribute of this particular park was this elevated walkway, a la the Chinese, so you could walk around and look down into the garden. Here another huge garden area, but at the grade of the houses nearby.